I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. Oh, hello there, good people. Welcome back to Icelandic Psycho. This is sort of a milestone on this channel because this is going to be the first time that I am ranking a director's films. Every single film of one director, and what better way to start off with than Stanley Kubrick. One of the greatest filmmakers ever. I mean, arguably, and maybe the best American director there ever was. And he's a really, really smart and intelligent person. You can just see it through his films. He really speaks through his films. Stanley Kubrick was someone that really studied photography and was a photographer before he was a filmmaker. And that is something that you can definitely see. So I want to start off by combining two films at the bottom, because I just want to get them out of the way, because those two films are just his sort of directorial debuts. This is when he was starting off. He wasn't fully fleshed there. So these films I'm talking about are Fear and Desire and Killer's Kiss. Now, I do prefer Fear and Desire. I feel more invested in it, and I find it more interesting because that was actually the first film he made. And I just find it so fascinating to see Kubrick at the start. Killer's Kiss is also Kubrick at the start, but I don't find myself so invested in it. It's a film that takes Kubrick on a more filmmaking journey. I know that Kubrick didn't really like these two films. I think especially Fear and Desire. Now, I do prefer it, but he goes further in Killer's Kiss, and then after those films, he just keeps going further and further. But let's go into my number 11 pick, which is Full Metal Jacket. Yeah, I know this is a film that is usually higher on people's list. I find the first half much more interesting, intriguing, gripping, and just overall more watchable. It's a totally different film. It just cuts in the half. You know, in the first half, Lee Emery gives this like great sort of over-the-top eccentric performance as this general, like, what's going on with you, sir? You know, it feels like sort of like something that J.K. Simmons did later in Whiplash. And Vincent D'Onofrio, he really goes unhinged at the end. So that film, that journey, the first half, it's pretty good. Then the second half just feels like this sort of weird documentary on Vietnam, and I just feel so distant from it. It feels a little bit lazy in a way. Well, those are my thoughts at least. So let's jump into yet another controversial pick, which is Dr. Strangelove.
What?
And I do realize that a lot of people have a strange love for this film. You know, I do recognize its black humor, awesomeness, and Peter Sellers, of course, he's awesome in this film. I heard he's the only actor that Stanley Kubrick didn't really direct. He just trusted him to do his job. So that's fascinating, and seems like, there's no fighting here, this is the war room! That is a lot of fun. I do admire what this film is trying to do, but I do feel like it is sort of its time. So let's go into number 9, which is Lolita. One of these early Kubrick films that still felt very much like Kubrick. And this was at the time that he was starting to be much more in control of the production. Kubrick was someone who most of the time was in control of production and writing as well. There's only one film that we'll talk about later that he didn't write. Anyways, so Lolita is a film that is one of the most censored and compressed films there ever was in the history of cinema. I think that's pretty accurate anyways, because they're taking a very sort of controversial story and putting it on screen in the 60s. Now there's a remake in the 90s directed by Adrian Lyne with Jeremy Irons as Hump. Yeah. And I just find that film more interesting. And the fact is that they were just able to go further with this, weird sort of pedophile story in the 90s. I think Jeremy Irons just gets a little bit further by being this sort of villain, and you sort of forget that he is the villain sometimes. So being this awful character, but you still sometimes forget that he is a difficult thing to do. And James Mason, he's okay, but even I feel like I'm more like watching this like sick weird guy, but Anyways, let's go into number 8, which is a very much a Hollywood production of its time. It's Spartacus, the only film that Stanley Kubrick did not write. This was not a Stanley Kubrick production. He was very much a hired director for this film. This is a film that Kirk Douglas really wanted to make. It has some great scenes like, I'm Spartacus, no, I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus. You know, it's, yeah, I do like these sort of films. I do, however, prefer Braveheart and Gladiator to this. I mean, there's not really much that I can say for this film other than it's good, it's not great, it has sort of a distinctive flair, but not a Kubrickian flair. So going into the next film, which is Paths of Glory, number 7, it's a film that feels much more Kubrick. One of the earlier Kubrick films, and you can really see his cinematography coming to life in this film when the camera is going back and the actors are walking towards it, and you're going through these, you know, war holes. What do you call that? This is a film that subjectively and objectively I had one of the most hardest times with putting into the list, because the fact of the matter is I'm trying to be as objective with this list as I can, but of course being subjective at the same time, because that's just how it works with lists like this. Anyways, this is one of these Kubrick films that is great in many ways. It has some gripping emotional scenes, mostly towards the end. The second half is better. I don't get so much invested in the first half, and these are not the sort of films that I tend to watch as well. However, it just doesn't feel as complete as many other Kubrick films. It walks the paths of glory, but just not all the way. Okay, let's go into number 6, which is sort of a controversial pick, so high, I do believe. It is The Killing. This is a film that I saw and I was just in awe of how ahead of its time it was in its filmmaking, in its structural story, and just the way things come together in this awesome film noir heist film. I can really see Kubrick in this film, and this is the film that was the first sort of full-length film. I just admire it for it. And I was just so shocked to see how this film seems to have influenced so many other directors. Particularly, I see Tarantino in this film. Of course, Tarantino is someone that really takes influences from a lot of stuff. Fascinating film. If you have not checked it out, make sure to do so. So now we're coming into the top 5, moving further and further towards greatness, right? In number 5 is Eyes Wide Shut. This is the last film that Stanley Kubrick made. You can really see this sort of evolution from the beginning to this film, because Stanley Kubrick is someone that was thought to be sort of like a control freak and a perfectionist. And I know his wife, that she really said that he got a little bit milder as the days goes on. You know, it ends on a rather happy note for Kubrick. But this film is sort of like, I mean, what's it about? It's about these couple that get into sort of a fight about this sexual fantasy that his wife had. So he just goes out on this like weird sexual escapade at night, goes into this weird club, very, very weird club, which is, you know, sort of like this gothic weird place with, you know, everyone having an orgy, and and then he just, you know, has to come back from that and confront his wife. So this is the film. In the shortest way possible explaining the film, this is it. But it's still, it is much more than that. And it just might be Tom Cruise's best performance that he ever gave. And I am someone that liked Tom Cruise. Nicole Kidman as well. Yeah, maybe so. The reason this film is not higher is because I feel like I don't have as much to say about it as I do that the top 4 is almost a masterpiece. It's like maybe just missing this 1% that the other have like complete. I don't really know how I can explain that better. It's maybe something about the editing that just feels slightly off. I don't know what it is. But let's go to the top 4, because these films I feel like are the Kubrickian masterpieces. These are the films that I can just see Kubrick at work all the way through. These films, they just have so much to offer. And this was the most difficult thing in this video, in this list, is to decide on these 4 films. So let's just go into number 4. And I had a very hard decision deciding between number 4 and 3 in particular. So bear with me on this one, and I will give you my reasoning, of course. So going into number 4 is Barry Lyndon. Now, I do believe that this is where Kubrick's cinematography comes to life like no other film. This just might be the most beautiful cinematography in the history of cinema because every frame, it's sort of like a painting. And sometimes in the middle of the film where I find myself not as invested, there comes a scene that I'm just in awe of what I'm seeing. It's so beautiful. And of course, Kubrick's direction is also a 10 out of 10. It most of the time is, really. However, if I'm just going by my heart, I have to admit that I'm just not as invested in the story and the characters that I am in the film that comes above it. And that comes down to the fact that Barry Lyndon is not the greatest protagonist to follow. He's a sort of wooden guy, and he's a little bit sociopathic, he's a little bit narcissistic, but he's also just this opportunist adventurer, and he always seems to get the best out of situations without much explaining behind it. For example, he pisses off some guy and goes into a fist fight with him and gets the better of him easily. But you never get any backstory to why he does that. He's just Barry Lyndon, and he's just going through life on more specific terms. I really like character journeys, and I find this to be a really interesting film in Stanley Kubrick's filmography. However, films like Big Fish and Forrest Gump, which this in a way reminds me of just a little bit, I find Edward Bloom and Forrest Gump to be much more likable, interesting characters to follow. And I do find that this film loses the plot a little bit in the middle, and then it picks up again in the third act. Coming in at number 3 is A Clockwork Orange. I'm just going by my heart here. I get invested in this film from the start. The camera going towards these goons and Matthew McDowell's narration, it's very captivating right from the get-go. Now this definitely is Kubrick's sort of weirdest films. It's the most Kubrickian film in a way as well. It's one of the most controversial films ever made. But I am much more interested in the story. And this is where I feel like Kubrick really nailed this 3-act structure. In the first half, there's this crazy guy going around with his friends, like raping and robbing and just going nuts all over the place. The second act, he's in prison. He's going through his program to be a better man, having to watch the screen and his eyes, locked in, and he can't do nothing except watch the screen to learn how to become a better person. I mean, this is a very interesting story, and I'm very invested in this story. And then with a perfect third act of him going back into society and having to adapt to the fact that now he is a better person. Do people believe him? And it's like he goes through all of the same things as a different person. And he has to get the consequences of what he did. And Kubrick's cinematography and filmmaking really comes to life in a very low budget film. He really pulled it off so fantastically greatly in this film, I believe. And this one scene in the film where Alex comes home to this sort of, what is it, psychiatrist character? It's like, yes, Alex, how's it going on? You've been a naughty boy, haven't you, Alex? Yes. And this film depicts such a weird situations and such weird, so many weird ways that characters interact. But it's so over the top and fun that you just can't help but keep watching. And Kubrick's black humor also really comes to life in this film. For example, the scene where Alex comes home after having been in the prison. And he walks into the living room where his parents are, and they have replaced him with someone else. And they're just like, oh, you're here, son? Well, we're sorry, we sort of replaced you. Yeah, you have been replaced, Alex. A much better son than you ever were. Get the hell out of here. And it's a very weird interactions in this scene. It's very Kubrick. It's very amazing. And the reason why this is at number 3 is because I am so enthusiastic about how weird and nuts this film is. I love it. I have to admit that. Just the music, the narration, everything in this film is just over the top, beautifully amazing. Amazing. This gets harder and harder as we go along, but number 2 is The Shining. One of the greatest horror films ever made, no doubt. You could say that this film is sort of like a straightforward horror film based on a novel by Stephen King, but there's nothing straightforward about Stanley Kubrick and his filmmaking. I believe Shining is everything but an ordinary horror film, because in a sense, it's a very Kubrickian horror film. It's the only horror film that he did And he really nailed it. He nailed every genre. And this is one of these films that just really sells me from the get-go. The scene where the camera is moving through the lake, the forest, through the road, and with the music, with this very captivating, eerie music. When I was going through this list in my head and trying to figure out if I was happy with it, if I found it to be accurate, and when I was going through The Shining and thinking of the film, I just realized that I just went into this hotel. I went into the film. I was experiencing these things with Jack Nicholson. This hotel was so beautifully executed, so beautifully structured, and everything in this hotel is mirrored in a way. Say what you will about Shelley Duvall's performance. I think her character is this sort of awkward, weird woman that becomes more awkward and more weird when she goes to the hotel. Just as Jack Torrance becomes more over the top, more crazy, and then of course like really, really crazy. And their son, being this sort of like weird psychic character, becomes more weird and more psychic because when these characters go to this hotel, they just evolve. And that is how I interpret the film. And I interpret the fact that Jack Torrance, he used to be in this hotel. You were always the caretaker here. Well, maybe he was at one point. Well, that is how I feel about this film. Number one is going to have to be 2001, A Space Odyssey. One of the greatest gifts to cinema ever. This film, it starts off completely blank. We just hear music. Everything is black. Because once there was nothing. And then we go into the dawn of man. Because once there was something that evolved. This film is all about evolution. And this is a science fiction masterpiece like no other. Many films have tried to copy it in a way. And many films have tried to go further in filmmaking. But this film, in its special effects, it's groundbreaking. I think no other film has been as groundbreaking at the time as this film, and I totally stand by that. And if you disagree with that, I would love to hear your take, because I can't think of any other film that did what this film did so perfectly is And of course, it's a slow film that in its first half, it's not as gripping as the second half with HAL 9000, which is, of course, the star of the film. I'm afraid I can't do that, Dave. That is where I totally go into the film and become totally invested in this sort of weird story with this artificial intelligence taking over, which it will do one day. It didn't do it in 2001, the year 2001, but it's starting to do it right now, you see? So, I mean, this film, it depicted the future in a very interesting way. And this film, like many other Stanley Kubrick films, was based on something. But it's much more of a Stanley Kubrick film than many people realize. It wasn't based on a book. There is a book that's called 2001, which came later. But this film, it's just based on a short story called, I believe, The Sentinel or something like that by Arthur C. Clarke. But Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke came together to write this film and to make this film. And then Arthur C. Clarke made the book 2010, A Space Odyssey. And that film is completely based on that book, but this film isn't. It's much more of a Kubrick story and a Kubrick work than people realize. Everything that Kubrick takes, he makes his own. And everything, even though it's based on book, the novel, short story, which most of his films are based on something loosely, but it's really Kubrick's work all the way. This is a masterpiece of cinema that just deserves to be studied and loved and just throughout the history of mankind. Which, I mean, this film is about the history of mankind, of course. And it goes through this very trippy journey in the end, which is all about evolution. So this, ladies and gentlemen, has been my complete ranking of Stanley Kubrick's filmography. This was amazingly fun to do, except for the drilling noises from the neighbors, which I had to start to record over and over again, those farting idiots. But except for that, I really, really love to do this. I mean, tell me your ranking of Stanley Kubrick's film down below. I would love to hear it. Oh, and I actually did a community poll on this channel, it seems some 3 weeks ago, so it's interesting to see how it stacks up. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and if this was your first video on the channel, you might want to consider subscribing. I would really appreciate that. And do comment down below, like I said, share your list of the Stanley Kubrick filmography. I will read it, I will respond to it, I would love to hear what you guys have to say. Now, until next time, keep your movies close and your physical media closer.